The wall gleamed like it had never known a fingerprint. Sergeant Dylan Marsh stood at attention in the center of a room that smelled like recycled air and political decisions, boots aligned with the glowing floor markers that pulsed faint blue beneath his feet. The ceremony hall of the United Earth Coalition Command was the kind of place designed to make soldiers feel small in a way that was supposed to feel honorable. High ceilings, cold light, rows of officers in pressed uniforms who had never personally fixed anything with their bare hands. Dylan had fixed something with his bare hands 3 weeks ago. He was still not sure how he felt about surviving it. The memory arrived the way it always did, without invitation, starting with the sound. Not an explosion. Explosions were clean, definitive things. This had been a long structural surrender of metal that had been holding too much for too long. The Harwick Station Stormgate had been designed to regulate the atmospheric interface between human deep space infrastructure and the volatile outer currents of Tempestian territory. It was, in the words of the engineering report Dylan had skimmed once and never needed to read again, a marvel of cross-species cooperative design. It had also been falling apart for 6 hours before anyone admitted it. He remembered the way the other men had looked at him when the last viable window appeared. The gate needed manual realignment from the inside. The inside meant standing inside a collapsing electromagnetic corridor during a level 4 atmospheric surge. The inside meant certain equipment failure, probable structural collapse, and a roughly 40% chance that anyone who entered would exit in a condition their families would find difficult to identify. The lieutenant had looked at the window, then at the men, then at the window again. Dylan had picked up the toolkit, not because he was brave. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself, because bravery implied a calm decision made from a position of clarity. What he had felt in that moment was closer to a specific and exhausted kind of logic. Someone had to do it. The lieutenant had a wife and 2 daughters in Portland. Reeves had just made it back from a medical discharge. Okafor was the best navigator in the battalion, and the battalion needed navigators more than it needed Dylan Marsh specifically. So he had walked into the corridor and pulled the hatch closed behind him. What followed was approximately 40 minutes of the most unpleasant physical experience of his adult life, and Dylan Marsh had once spent 11 days in a forward position in a mountain range with a broken heating unit and 1 functioning boot. The storm gate screamed around him. Metal expanded and contracted in waves he could feel in his back teeth. Every system he touched sparked or shorted or simply refused to acknowledge his existence. He worked by feel and by the kind of stubborn refusal to stop that had less to do with courage and more to do with the fact that stopping would mean having gone through all of this for nothing. The gate realigned at the 38-minute mark. He had walked out on his own 2 feet, which he had considered a personal victory. The battalion had considered it something else entirely. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now he stood in a ceremony hall that was far too clean for the kind of business it conducted, waiting to find out what the United Earth Coalition intended to do with the fact that he had not died. General Bastian cleared his throat. The sound moved through the room with the particular resonance of a man who had spent decades ensuring that, when he spoke, architecture cooperated. He was a solid figure, gray at the temples, with the kind of bearing that suggested he had personally informed gravity of its duties and expected regular reports on compliance. "Sergeant Dylan Marsh," General Bastian said, his voice distributed evenly through the hall by systems Dylan could not see. "For your actions during the Harwick Station atmospheric crisis, specifically your decision to remain and manually realign a collapsing storm gate while under active electromagnetic interference and structural failure conditions." Dylan kept his expression composed. He had practiced composed in the transport on the way here. He was good at composed. Composed was the face you made when you were being looked at by people who needed you to represent something larger than the fact that you were cold and tired and your left shoulder still ached when the temperature dropped. "You are hereby granted a commendation of the highest interspecies cooperative order," Bastian continued. That part sounded fine. Dylan allowed himself to breathe slightly more normally. "In accordance with treaty stipulations ratified by the United Earth Coalition and the sovereign storm courts of Tempestus," Bastian continued, and something in his voice shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a pilot's voice shifts when they are about to deliver news about turbulence that is worse than expected. "You are also hereby awarded a bonded political union." The room did not make a sound. Dylan blinked once. The silence stretched like something elastic being tested past its reasonable limits. Behind him, somewhere in the assembled rows of officers, someone coughed. It was the kind of cough that could have been sympathy. It could have been stifled laughter. Standing where he was, Dylan could not tell which, and he was not certain which would be worse. What, sir?" he said. His mouth had moved before his brain could complete its review of whether speaking was advisable. General Bastian's expression did not change in any way that could be formally documented, but something around his eyes suggested he was personally unhappy with the situation and had been since approximately the moment it was explained to him. "A marriage, Sergeant." Dylan considered several responses. He rejected the first four on grounds of professional survival. He settled on the one that felt most like honest confusion because it was. "I think there's been a mistake, sir." "There has not. I'm not married." "Correct. I didn't fill out any forms. I didn't meet anyone. I didn't—" He gestured briefly at himself, which accomplished nothing but felt necessary. "Sir, I fixed a storm gate." "Yes," Bastian said. "And in doing so, you fulfilled the qualifying criteria outlined in Article 7 of the Tempestian Cooperative Treaty, which was ratified before either of us had strong feelings about it." He exhaled through his nose. "This is not a request, Sergeant." The air in the room shifted. It was subtle, the way important things often were before they became impossible to ignore. The light in the center of the hall folded inward briefly, reality taking a moment to rearrange its priorities. A holographic projection assembled itself in the space in front of Dylan with the unhurried confidence of something that had never needed to hurry. She was tall. That was the first thing his brain registered, because height was simple and his brain was currently conserving resources. She stood with the particular posture of someone for whom gravity was a suggestion rather than a law weight distributed, like she had made a conscious and sovereign choice to remain standing and could rescind it at any time. Her features were sharp without being harsh, unmistakably humanoid in most of the ways that mattered, except for the long ears that swept back from her head in elegant tapering lines that ended in fine points. They were not decorative. They moved with her attention. They were, Dylan understood, in some wordless and immediate way, part of how she listened. Her eyes moved across the room with the practiced efficiency of someone cataloging a space for exits and threats before deciding whether to be bored. They landed on Dylan and stayed there. She looked at him the way a person looks at a weather report that has just predicted something inconvenient. "Is this him?" she said. Her voice was smooth and sharp in equal measure, carrying an accent that moved like water over stone, musical in its structure, dangerous in its precision. "Princess Vara of the Sovereign Storm Courts," General Bastian said with the tone of someone reading a warning label aloud in a room full of people who had already opened the container. "Heir of Tempestus." The princess crossed her arms. Static danced faintly at the edges of her projected form. He looked smaller than the report suggested. Dylan felt something sharp and immediate move through him. He had carried a man twice his weight out of a collapsed trench in conditions that would have sent most equipment into failure mode. He was not small, he was proportional. "I'm standing right here," he said. "Yes," Vera said, looking at him with an expression that suggested his presence was both confirmed and problematic. "That is what concerns me." Restrained amusement moved through the assembled officers like a wave that had been told to stay low. Dylan felt the back of his neck warm in a way that had nothing to do with the room's climate systems. General Bastian pressed forward with the determination of a man who had decided that humor was a hostile force, and he would not be surrendering to it today. "This union symbolizes trust between our peoples, a joining of strength in our born. Punishment," Vera added pleasantly. "You forgot punishment," Bastian continued as though she had not spoken, which Dylan suspected was a skill the man had spent years developing. "The Union represents the highest commitment of the cooperative accord. Sergeant Marsh, you will be briefed on the formal requirements at 1400 hours." Dylan looked at the hologram. He looked at the general. He looked back at the hologram. "So let me understand this correctly," he said, keeping his voice level with the same effort he had used to keep his hands steady inside a disintegrating storm gate. "I didn't die fixing an electromagnetic corridor, so now I'm politically married to an alien princess." "Yes," Bastian said. Vara tilted her head. "Alien soldier," she said with the precision of someone correcting a mathematical error. "You make it sound as though I am the unusual one in this arrangement." Dylan rubbed his face with one hand. It did not help. "This is above my pay grade." "On the contrary," Vera replied, the faintest edge of something almost like humor moving beneath the surface of her voice. "It appears to be precisely because of it." Thunder moved through the holographic projection, faint and resonant, like a reminder of something larger, waiting beyond the edges of the transmission. The room's environmental stabilizers hummed in response. Dylan had the distinct and settled impression that his life had just been filed under a different heading and no one had thought to ask if he approved of the new category. Princess Vara of Tempestus learned about her engagement the way she learned about most inconvenient truths. She was already in the middle of something else she was angry about. She was standing barefoot on the high balcony above the capital city, which stretched below her in towers of storm-polished stone and rain-softened light, arguing with Counselor Dre and two junior aides who had not yet developed the survival instincts to stand farther back. The sky behind her was doing what tempestuous skies did when she was in a complicated mood, which was attempt every available shade between deep blue and oncoming catastrophe simultaneously. Dre was a long, composed man with sharp cheekbones and the kind of stillness that came not from calm, but from years of calculating exactly how much could be said without triggering consequences. He served the storm courts with the particular loyalty of someone who had decided long ago that the institution mattered more than the people inside it, which Vara had always found both admirable and deeply irritating. "You cannot assign me a husband the way you reassign a faulty atmospheric processor," Vara said. Her voice was level. It was the level of someone who had drawn a line at the edge of a cliff and was explaining its location with great clarity before anyone stepped over it. "I am not a component." "With respect, Highness," Dre said, adjusting the collar of his insulating cloak in the subtle way he always did when he was nervous. "You function as a symbol of the court." Vera smiled. The clouds darkened by two precise gradations. "Symbols fall over when you stack too much nonsense on them, Counselor." One of the junior aides made a small, involuntary movement backward. The weather monitoring drone hovering at the edge of the balcony chimed a pulse warning and immediately short-circuited, spiraling off the railing in a trail of sparks and smoke. No one mentioned it. Everyone had learned not to mention the drones. "The treaty requires a gesture," Dre continued, because he was the kind of man who continued. "A meaningful one. The human soldier fulfills the criteria. He is decorated, loyal, and politically uncomplicated." Vara turned her head and looked at him with the particular attention of someone who has just identified a word that does not belong where it was placed. "Uncomplicated," she said. "Is that what we are calling it?" "It is an accurate description. It is a way of saying he is someone no one will argue about losing." The temperature on the balcony dropped 4 degrees. The aides pulled their cloaks tighter in unison. Professionals, even in distress. Dre held her gaze, which Vara noted took visible effort. "Your temperament, Highness, has complicated certain diplomatic relationships. The storm courts need stabilization. This union provides the appearance of it." "The appearance," Vara repeated softly. She turned back to the railing and looked out over the city. Tempestus in a gray rain was the most honest version of itself she had always thought. The towers did not soften. The storm did not pretend. Below her, citizens moved through the lower streets under the shelter of walkway shields, going about their lives with the particular resilience of a people who had grown up understanding that the weather was personal. The soldier stood inside a collapsing storm gate, Dre said, pressing forward with his case. Alone. Against every reasonable calculation of survival, he stayed because he decided to. "That is not nothing, Highness." Vera said nothing for a moment. "Then that already sounds unbearable." But later, after Dre and the aides had retreated under the combined pressure of a worsening sky and their own instinct for self-preservation, Vera stood alone in her private chambers and pulled up the recording herself. She had told herself she was reviewing it for tactical information. She needed to understand what she was dealing with. She needed to assess the situation with the same clear attention she gave every other political imposition that arrived in her life without asking permission. The recording showed a ceremony hall on a human military station. Clean walls regulated light rows of uniformed officers. In the center, a single soldier stood at attention with the posture of someone who had learned stillness through practice rather than through comfort. He was not what she had expected. She had expected someone larger in the way that loud things were large. Someone who wore his survival as an announcement, who carried his commendation like a weapon already drawn. The soldier in the recording looked with remarkable consistency across the entire footage, like a man who had made peace with the universe being inconvenient and had simply decided to keep showing up anyway. He stood too straight, He frowned at authority, the way a person frowns at weather, acknowledging it, without being particularly surprised by it. When the recording reached the moment where General Bastian delivered the news, and Sergeant Dylan Marsh looked at the hologram of her own face and said in the flat tone of someone stating a geometric problem, "I think there's been a mistake, sir." Vera laughed. It came out of her sharp and sudden, the way laughter did when it had not been planned. The lights in the chamber flickered in response, a brief cascade of brightnesses that traveled the length of the room and settled back into normal. Outside, the rain paused for exactly 2 seconds, then resumed. She watched the rest of the recording with her arms still crossed, but the set of her shoulders had changed. "You have no idea," she said quietly to the frozen final frame, where Dylan Marsh stood with his hand over his face in a gesture that communicated with impressive economy that he had come here to accept a medal and was very much not prepared for the rest of it. Vara had been prepared for every other thing in her life. Every ceremony, every negotiation, every carefully arranged appearance designed to demonstrate that the heir of Tempestus was both powerful and manageable, which were two qualities that the Storm Courts wanted her to embody simultaneously without ever acknowledging the fundamental tension between them. She had been prepared for all of it. She was not, she discovered, particularly prepared for someone who looked at his own life, being rearranged without his consent, and simply said out loud that it was wrong. She turned off the recording. She stood in the quiet of her chambers while the rain continued outside at its normal pace. Then she went back to the beginning and watched it again. The transit station that served as neutral ground between human deep space territory and the outer edge of Tempestian influence was a study in forced compromise. Everything about it was designed by committee, built to be inoffensive to both parties, and had accordingly arrived at a final aesthetic that was mildly unpleasant to everyone. The corridors were too wide by human standards and too low by Tempestian ones. The lighting was a negotiated color temperature that suited neither biology perfectly, and the gravitational calibration changed subtly every 40 meters in a way that experienced travelers learned to feel in their knees. Dylan had been waiting in the docking bay for 11 minutes when she arrived. He had spent those 11 minutes trying to decide what the correct posture was for meeting an alien princess, to whom he had apparently been married by bureaucratic accident. He had settled on standing at a slight ease, hands loosely at his sides, expression arranged into something he hoped communicated professional openness, without either servility or aggression. What he had not accounted for was the way the pressure in the room changed when she walked in. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself with thunder or light. It was simply that the air in the bay recalibrated when Vera crossed the threshold, settling into a different configuration around her, the way a room reorganizes its acoustics when the right person enters. The officers flanking Dylan straightened in small, unconscious adjustments. A Tempestian aide near the door took one deliberate step sideways. Dylan himself felt the atmospheric change in the back of his throat, a faint electrical quality, like the moment before a storm commits to being a storm. She was taller in person than the hologram had suggested. Her long ears moved with her gaze, tracking the room with a continuous low-level attention that was separate from and parallel to wherever her eyes were pointed. She wore traveling clothes in the deep gray blue of Tempestian formal wear, which moved like they were made of something that had its own opinion about the direction it fell. She saw him. The slight forward motion of her approach did not change its pace, but something in her attention sharpened. Dylan straightened instinctively, and the top of his head connected cleanly with the low edge of a Tempestian structural beam he had not seen coming. It made a sound, Vera said pleasantly without altering her pace. Our architecture resents confidence. Dylan rubbed the back of his head. The pain was sharp and immediate and deeply undignified. He considered his options and chose the one that felt most honest. He huffed a short, quiet laugh. Noted. It was a small sound. A private sound, the kind that comes out when something is genuinely more absurd than expected. He was not performing it for her benefit, and she seemed to understand that, which was perhaps why her response was not the cool dismissal he had half anticipated. Instead, she stopped walking and looked at him with an expression he could not fully read, but which contained somewhere in its architecture something that might have been recalculation. "Sergeant Marsh," she said. "Princess Vera." They stood there in the slightly awkward way of two people who have been told to begin a relationship and are discovering that instructions do not actually bridge the fundamental strangeness of being two separate persons, or rather one human being and one being that was humanoid in most of the ways that counted, which Dylan was choosing not to overthink. So, he said after a moment, Princess Soldier, is it too late to ask if this is some kind of elaborate misunderstanding that resolves itself if I wait long enough? Vera tilted her head and regarded him. She began to walk around him slowly, not in a circle exactly, more in the way someone examines a situation from different angles before deciding how to relate to it. Her hands were clasped at the small of her back. No, she said, but it is early enough for regret. That's efficient. We are known for it. A Tempestian aide cleared her throat at a respectful distance. Your quarters have been prepared. Shared accommodation in accordance with... No, Vera said. At the same moment Dylan said shared, they looked at each other. The aide winced with the professionalism of someone who had anticipated this exact outcome and had prepared a contingency. Negotiable, she said. Vera leaned forward slightly, and Dylan saw for the first time what he would later understand was a signature of hers, the way she closed distance, not to be physically imposing, but to make absolutely certain that what she said next would be received without the possibility of ambiguity. She was close enough that he could see the faint static sparking at the outer edges of her irises, so subtle it might have been a trick of the light if the light had been doing anything unusual, which it was not. Do not misunderstand me, human, she said quietly. I did not choose you. Dylan held her gaze. He did not step back. Good, he said, because I didn't choose you either. The sparks at the edges of her irises stilled. Something moved across her expression that was not quite surprise and not quite interest, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Well, Vera said, straightening slowly, this is already going terribly. I get that a lot, Dylan said. Somewhere in the station's structure carried through conduit and corridor by systems designed to manage the atmospheric presence of Tempestian royalty, a low and distant roll of something that might have been thunder moved through the walls. Not threatening, not demanding, simply noting in the quiet way of large things that do not need to announce themselves that it was paying attention. The transport vessel that carried them toward Tempestus was a joint-built craft designed under the cooperative protocols to accommodate both human and Tempestian physiological preferences, which meant it did both imperfectly and neither well. The gravity plating was calibrated for a compromised weight distribution that gave everything a faintly waterlogged quality. The lighting cycled through color temperatures at intervals that followed a logic Dylan had not been able to identify. The seats in the main observation corridor were shaped for a body type that appeared to be somewhere between the two species averages, which meant they were genuinely comfortable for neither. Dylan had strapped himself into the nearest acceleration chair and was studying the readouts when Vera said without preamble, the jump corridor is crooked. He looked up. Through the viewport space was doing the thing it did during faster-than-light transit, the stretched geometry that his brain had never entirely made peace with the sense of distance being folded rather than crossed. That's just how it looks, he said. It should not look like that. She was standing, which was apparently her default setting when she was annoyed. Her long ears moved with a subtle, independent frequency that he was beginning to understand was not incidental. Storm paths curve with intent. This looks lazy. Human engineering philosophy tends toward functional rather than elegant. I had noticed. She paced the length of the corridor, and the air around her moved in the slightly charged way he was starting to recognize as the atmospheric equivalent of someone drumming their fingers. Static played at the edges of surfaces she passed without touching them. Your propulsion systems are also inefficient, and your atmospheric recycling smells like an argument that no one won. Some of our best work, Dylan said. The ship lurched, then smoothed as if embarrassed by the lurch. Dylan looked at the readouts, then at Vera. Are you doing something to the jump drive? She paused. Doing is a strong word. What would you call it? Expressing an opinion. He exhaled slowly through his nose. Please tell me you don't do that during landings. I try not to. Gravity and I have an ongoing disagreement, but we have reached a working relationship. She came to a stop at the other end of the corridor, looking out at the stretched stars with an expression that was difficult to read in profile, something between irritation and something older. The storms on Tempestus do not behave like this. They move with purpose. They arrive knowing what they intend to do. Dylan watched her for a moment. Is that better or worse, do you think? She turned her head to look at him over her shoulder. It seemed to be a question she had not expected. Better, she said finally. Storms that know what they are do not waste time pretending to be something else. They passed the next stretch of the journey in a silence that was uncomfortable at first and then gradually was not. Dylan learned that Tempestian timekeeping was built on atmospheric cycles rather than solar rotation, that the storm courts had been in continuous operation for over 4,000 years without changing their procedural language once, and that Vara thought artificial gravity was, in her precise words, philosophically unconvincing. Vara learned that Dylan had joined the military at 22 because the structure appealed to him, that he had spent years in positions of increasingly specific danger without ever having been certain why the military kept finding uses for someone who asked as many questions as he did, and that he had a habit of keeping practical things in whatever pocket was closest to his left hand, which she found both logical and slightly alien in its specificity. She tested this last observation by asking what was in his left jacket pocket. He produced a small multi-tool, a folded square of insulation tape, and a charge adapter that fit neither the standard coalition port nor any Tempestian socket she had ever seen. She stared at the adapter. "What does that connect to?" "Nothing currently," he said. "But I found it in the debris field after the storm gate collapsed, and I keep it because there might be a day when it matters." Vara looked at the adapter for a long moment, then at him. Something shifted in her expression that she did not try to name. She put it back in his hand without comment and turned back to the viewport. The descent toward Tempestus was an experience that Dylan filed under things he would remember accurately only in the middle of the night for the rest of his life. The planet announced itself through the viewport in overlapping systems of storm and cloud-braided weather patterns that covered entire continents in churning motion, internal lightning, flashing through cloud formations so massive they registered as geographical features. It was one of the most genuinely beautiful and genuinely threatening things he had ever seen in a career that contained a considerable number of candidates for both categories. As they broke through the upper cloud layer and the full scale of it became apparent, Dylan said nothing. He did not have anything adequate available. Vera stood beside him at the viewport, and for the first time since he had met her, her posture was not composed or controlled or performing composure for anyone's benefit. She was simply there looking at her home the way people look at things that are too large and too familiar to pretend about. Her long ears were still. The charged quality of the air around her had settled into something different, quieter, like a frequency, finding its natural resonance. "You are allowed to be afraid," she said quietly. "I know," Dylan said. "I just prefer not to be useless while I am." She turned her head and looked at him with an expression that was not quite recognition and not quite surprise, but lived near both. She did not say anything. She turned back to the viewport, but the quality of the silence between them shifted by some small and specific degree that Dylan noted and did not announce. The landing platform rose to meet them through rain so dense it had achieved a kind of structural ambition, as though it had decided to be a solid and was simply working out the engineering. The hatch opened with a resonant clang, and warm, charged air rushed in smelling of ozone and deep stone, and something else Dylan had no reference for, something old and clean and enormous. Vera stepped forward. Shoulders back, chin lifted, her long ears angled into the wind. The rain eased. Not completely. Not in the way of something that had been stopped. In the way of something that had been acknowledged and was stepping back slightly out of courtesy. Dylan stared. She had not looked at it. She had not made a gesture or spoken a word. "You didn't even look at it," he said. "I do not have to," Vera said. "It listens." He followed her onto the platform boots, finding purchase on rain-slicked stone with the careful placement of a man who had learned not to trust surfaces that looked reliable. The city spread below them in illuminated towers and rain-shrouded walkways, and the sky above moved with a particular authority of a sky that considered itself a participant in events rather than a backdrop to them. Somewhere in the deep distance, thunder rolled once without urgency. "Welcome," Vera said, glancing at him sideways in a way that carried something dry and direct that he was beginning to suspect was her version of warmth. "To my problem." Dylan adjusted his jacket against the weight of the rain. His shoulder ached from the storm gate work, the old injury that weather aggravated. His head still throbbed faintly where the beam had made its point. He was standing on a planet that was not his in a marriage he had not consented to, with a woman who could apparently negotiate with weather systems and found his architecture-related head injuries professionally concerning. "You know," he said, "this still beats being shot at." "Give it time, soldier," Vera said. And there was something in the way she said it, not quite a warning, not quite a welcome, something that sat precisely at the edge of both, that made Dylan Marsh think that whatever this was, it was not going to be simple, and it was not going to be short, and it was possibly not going to be the worst thing that had ever happened to him. He followed her toward the palace doors. The storm settled around them both, not gentle, not calm, simply present, as if it had made a decision about the two of them and was waiting to see if they would come to the same conclusion. The palace tried very hard to impress visitors. Dylan had learned through accumulated experience that the more a place tried to impress you, the more it had to hide. The corridors shifted subtly as they walked floor gradients, adjusting to Vera's stride with the practiced accommodation of a building that had been designed around a specific person. Dylan compensated by walking the way he walked on ships, in rough weather, deliberate, low-centered, not trusting the ground to stay where he expected it. The guards they passed wore armor that hummed at a frequency he felt more than heard, eyes-forward expressions carrying the specific blankness of people trained to observe everything and react to nothing, which Dylan respected as a professional achievement. Counselor Dre was waiting in the court chamber with the careful stillness of a man who had positioned himself precisely and intended to remain there. He was tall, narrow in the shoulders, with features that arranged themselves in an expression of welcome that did not reach any part of his face that could not be turned off quickly. He bowed to Vera with exact calibration, the bow of a man who had spent considerable time determining the minimum depth that qualified as respectful without communicating anything beyond the minimum. His eyes moved to Dylan. The assessment was brief and thorough and arrived at a visible conclusion before it was politely redirected. "Your Highness," Dre said, "we were not informed the soldier would attend the formal reception." Vera's expression was pleasant in the specific way that Dylan was learning to read as preceding something precise. "That," she said, "is because I enjoy surprises, Counselor." Dre's gaze returned to Dylan. It contained the particular quality of a man categorizing something he intended to address at a more convenient time. "He appears intact." "I make it a habit," Dylan said before the part of his brain that managed self-preservation could review the sentence. Several heads turned. One aide audibly inhaled. The assembled nobles of the Storm Court, who had arranged themselves along the walls of the chamber with the careful positioning of people who wanted to observe without appearing to do so, all found reasons to focus on Dylan with slightly more attention than they had been giving him before. Vera's shoulders moved with a suppressed reaction. She turned to him with an expression that was controlled except around the very edges. "You may speak," she said with the warmth of someone giving permission that was also an invitation to continue, "since you are here as my honored consort." Dylan looked at her. "Is consort good or bad?" "Yes," she said. The proceedings that followed were everything that formal political ritual had always been, full of language, designed to convey meaning without committing to it, structured around silences that were louder than the sentences on either side of them. Dylan listened with the particular patience of a man who had sat through enough military briefings to understand that the important information was usually located somewhere other than where the speaker appeared to be directing attention. He counted at one point how many times a noble or aide flinched or repositioned themselves when Vera shifted her weight. It was a higher number than he had anticipated. He stopped counting at 14. Dre rose at a particular moment in the proceedings and began outlining the behavioral expectations of the Union with the careful phrasing of a man who had rehearsed the language specifically to make it difficult to object to. He spoke about stability, about the importance of consistent representation, about the value to both peoples of a calm and legible public presence. He reached the section about emotional moderation. Vera raised one finger. The lights in the chamber flickered. A wind stirred from no visible source, moving papers on the nearest table with the definitive quality of something that has chosen to make itself understood. The air in the room developed an electrical quality that moved across the back of Dylan's neck like a warning. "I am not a malfunction," Vera said. Her voice was completely calm, which made it considerably more effective than shouting would have been. "And he is not a leash." The silence that followed was the kind that considers itself carefully. Dylan cleared his throat. "For the record," he said, "I don't look good in collars." It worked in the way that honest absurdity sometimes works, by breaking the surface tension of a moment that had become too rigid to continue on its own terms. Laughter moved through the room, hesitant at first, then genuine, as nobles and aides arrived at the realization that they were permitted to breathe again. Even Dre produced a smile, though it arrived and departed quickly like a visitor who had arrived at the wrong address. Vera looked at Dylan with an expression that was brief and direct, and contained in its brief directness the acknowledgement of something that had just shifted between them. "Useful," she murmured. Outside the formal session on a terrace that opened onto a sky that had settled into a deep and thoughtful gray, Vera stood at the railing in a stillness that was different from her court stillness. Less performance, more weight. You didn't have to do that, she said. Dylan stood beside her watching the city below navigate its evening routines through sheets of light rain. Seemed like someone should. They will not forget it. Good, he said. I hate repeating myself. She studied him for a long moment. He could feel the attention of it without looking directly at her the way you feel the presence of something significant in your peripheral vision. Then she laughed softly, the sound of it private and unguarded in a way that was entirely different from the sharp burst that had escaped her in her chambers. The wind on the terrace quieted in response, the rain easing by one careful degree. You are very strange for a soldier, she said. You're very calm for a storm, he replied. She was quiet for a moment. Do not tell anyone that. Below them, the city of Tempestus moved through its evening, as it always had, the towers lit against the gray, the walkways full of people who had built their entire civilization around the knowledge that the weather was not separate from them. Above them, clouds reorganized themselves in slow architectural progressions, as if thinking through a problem that was interesting enough to take its time with. Dylan stood on the terrace of a palace on a planet that was not his, next to a woman who had not wanted him there, and had somewhere in the space of a few hours stopped being entirely opposed to his presence. It was not comfort. It was not safety. It was something harder to name, and because of that, more likely to be real. Inside the palace, Counselor Dre returned to his private chambers and opened a secure transmission log. He composed his first report on the Union with the careful precision of a man who knew exactly what conclusion he was building toward and exactly how long he intended to take getting there. He cataloged what he had observed: the laughter on the terrace, the princess's unguarded stillness, the way she had looked at the soldier when she thought she was not being watched. He filed the report under its designated category, Emotional Irregularities Ongoing Assessment Required. He sent it. Then he composed a second message, shorter and addressed to a different recipient entirely, and sent that one too. The palace had a memory. Dylan understood this within the first 3 days of living inside it. Not a memory in the way that old buildings held the impressions of weather and time in their walls, the particular settling of foundations, the way light moved through windows that had been cut to accommodate a sun that was slightly different from the one you had grown up under. This was more specific than that. The Palace of Tempestus remembered who it was built for, and it arranged itself accordingly every morning without being asked. The floors adjusted their gradient to Vera's stride the moment she left her chambers. The light in the quarters she used most frequently calibrated to a shade that was neither quite natural nor quite artificial, something in between that suited the particular quality of her attention. Doors opened half a second before she reached them. Climate systems maintained a temperature that was several degrees cooler than the human standard Dylan had been quietly requesting since his second night, which the palace acknowledged by providing him with an additional blanket and appearing to consider the matter resolved. He had stopped arguing with the building by day 4. What he had not stopped doing was paying attention. Vera moved through the palace the way she moved through everything, with the particular authority of someone who had never had the option of being uncertain in public. She met with advisors in the formal reception rooms with the polished composure of a woman who had been performing composure since before she could articulate the difference between the performance and the thing itself. She reviewed atmospheric reports with the focused attention of someone reading a language that was also a relationship. She appeared at scheduled functions, with her long ears precisely angled and her expression arranged into whatever version of herself the occasion required. And then in the spaces between those things, she was someone slightly different. Not softer exactly. Vera was not a soft person, and Dylan had no particular expectation that she would become one. But there were moments in the side quarters, and the back terraces, and the small hours of the morning when the palace had stopped performing its duties with full enthusiasm and was simply existing when she moved without the performance attached. When her ears tracked sounds she found interesting rather than politically relevant. When she looked at things, the city, the sky, the rain on the stone, with an expression that was purely private. He learned to recognize those moments. He did not announce them. On the morning of the 6th day, he found her in one of the upper observation rooms, standing at a wide viewport with her back to the door, watching a weather system build over the eastern reaches of the capital. It was early enough that the palace had not fully committed to the day yet. The light was gray and tentative. She was wearing informal clothes, which on Tempestus meant something deep-colored and unstructured, and her feet were bare on the cool floor. Dylan stopped in the doorway. He had come for coffee or the closest thing Tempestus offered to it, a dark and aggressively aromatic substance that the kitchen staff provided him with expressions that suggested they found his requirement for it both comprehensible and slightly pitiful. He turned to leave. "You can stay," Vera said without turning around. He stayed. He poured himself a measure of the dark liquid from the carafe on the side table and stood at a distance that felt respectful, watching the same weather system she was watching build its gray architecture over the eastern districts. The silence between them was the kind that did not require filling. He had met very few people in his life who understood that particular kind of quiet, the shared attention to something outside both of you, but he had valued them when he found them. She began teaching him to read the storms 3 days later. It happened without announcement, the way things between them seemed to happen not as planned events, but as the natural consequence of two people sharing a space and discovering that one of them knew something the other did not. They stood at the high terrace railing on the 9th morning. City spread below them in its rainy grandeur, and Vera pointed at the eastern system she had been watching for days. "That one is frustrated," she said. Dylan looked at it. It looked like a storm system to him, which was to say a large and complicated arrangement of moisture and electrical activity that he respected from a professional distance. "How can you tell?" "The way the leading edge moves. When a storm knows what it wants, the front is clean. It has direction. When it is working something out, the leading edge folds back on itself like this." She traced the shape in the air with one hand, a gesture that was more precise than it looked, as though she was describing a specific grammar rather than a general impression. "It has been like that for 4 days. It will resolve tonight." Resolve into what? She considered. Probably into rain and then clarity. Sometimes frustration just needs to complete itself. Dylan looked at the storm and then at her and did not say the thing that seemed obvious. She had been watching him not say it. "Go ahead," she said. "I was just thinking that it sounds like you." The silence that followed was not hostile. She looked back at the storm. "Yes," she said finally with the simple directness of someone confirming a fact they had long since stopped trying to argue with. "It does." They returned to the same spot on the 10th morning, in the 11th, and the 12th. Not by arrangement, not because anyone had scheduled it, simply because the terrace was where the storms were most visible, and the storms were the thing between them that required the least translation. By the 10th day, Dylan had developed a practical understanding of the palace's unspoken rules. Most of them were not written anywhere. They existed the way long-standing conventions always existed, in the space between what people said and what people understood, in the particular quality of a silence, or the angle of a glance from someone who had been in service here long enough to have absorbed the institution into their bones. The first rule was that you did not precede Vara anywhere. Not through doors, not into rooms, not down corridors she was using. The building systems managed this automatically by simply not opening doors until she was ready, but the rule extended to the personnel as well, and the speed with which even senior staff adjusted their pace when she was present told him something about the history behind the courtesy. The second rule was that you did not comment on the weather unless she commented first. This was less a rule of etiquette and more a rule of survival, because commenting on the weather on Tempestus was more often than not commenting on the person who influenced it, and not everyone in the palace had made peace with the implications of that fact. The third rule, which took him longer to understand because it was the most subtle, was that you did not look directly at Vera when she was in a formal setting and did not know you were watching. This was not a rule about privacy. It was a rule about power, and it cut in both directions. The people who looked at her when she was unaware were cataloging. He had watched Dre do it. He had watched the junior aides do it. He had watched Greer do it during his corridor conversation, though Greer had been cataloging Dylan rather than Vera, which amounted to the same thing. Dylan did not catalog. He observed, which was a different action with a different intention, and Vera seemed to know the difference. He had noticed this on the 7th day when he had been standing at the far end of the observation room, and she had been reviewing atmospheric data at the central display, and she had said without turning, "You observe differently than they do." He had asked her what she meant. "Most people in this palace look at me to find something," she said, "to find evidence or weakness or the angle of approach for whatever they intend to do next. You look at me the way you look at the weather," she paused, "like something that is worth understanding for its own sake." He had not had an answer for that. He had gone back to his observation. She had returned to her data. The morning had continued in the way tempestuous mornings continued, with the quiet authority of a planet that did not require approval to proceed. On the 11th day, Vera found the nutrition bar. She had picked up his jacket from the chair where he had draped it, intending to move it to a different surface so she could lay out a set of atmospheric charts for review. The jacket was heavier than expected. She investigated with the focused attention she gave unfamiliar objects and produced from the interior left pocket a compact rectangle wrapped in sealed packaging that had no tempestant markings and no obvious purpose. She turned it over. She examined both ends with the methodical care of someone conducting a structural assessment. She held it up to the light. "What is this?" she said. Dylan looked up from the translation document on the room's display. "Nutrition bar, standard field ration. I carry them because they require no decisions." She studied it further. "What does it taste like?" "Regret," he said, "but filling." She bit into it with the decisive commitment of someone who had decided to experience something fully rather than cautiously. The silence that followed lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then a precise and contained bolt of lightning snapped against the reinforced section of the bulkhead behind her, leaving a faint scorch line on the stone that the palace would by morning have polished away. Vera chewed with an expression of deep and specific betrayal. "You eat this," she said, "voluntarily." "We've eaten worse on longer deployments." She stared at him. "That explains a great deal about how your species approaches suffering. We consider it practical." "You consider it practical," she repeated slowly, as though adding this to a file she was building on the subject of humans in general and Dylan Marsh in particular. Then she took another bite. The second lightning strike was smaller. He counted it as progress. She finished the bar. She set the wrapper down on the table with the deliberate care of someone lodging a formal complaint through the appropriate channels. Then she returned to the atmospheric charts without further comment, which Dylan understood in the context of Vera to mean that she had decided the experience was acceptable. Ambassador Greer arrived on the 14th day. Dylan encountered him in the communications corridor outside the transit wing, which was one of the longer and quieter passages in the palace designed for travel between the formal reception areas and the station interface. It was not a corridor where casual conversations happened, which was precisely why it was chosen for this one. Greer was young for his title, somewhere in his mid-30s, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that suggested he understood that presentation was a form of communication and had decided to be fluent in it. He wore the diplomatic uniform of the United Earth Coalition with the ease of someone who had worn it long enough that it had become a second skin. He smiled when he saw Dylan, and the smile was warm and wide and arrived at its full dimensions a fraction of a second too quickly. "Sergeant Marsh," he said, extending his hand. "Ambassador Greer, I wanted to extend my personal congratulations on the union. A significant moment for both our peoples." Dylan shook the offered hand. "That's one way to describe it." Greer laughed with the practiced ease of a man who had been taught that laughing at other people's understatements built rapport. "I imagine it's been quite an adjustment, but the princess seems engaged. The court reports have been positive." He fell into step beside Dylan without being invited, which Dylan noted. "I did want to ask purely as a matter of administrative preparation on our end. Have you had the opportunity to review the full treaty documentation? All of the operational clauses?" "I was briefed on the primary terms." Of course, of course." Greer's tone was the conversational equivalent of a man laying out items on a table and pretending not to notice where the important ones were. "The operational structure is fairly standard for these arrangements. 18-month initial period, stability assessment at the 12-month mark, and then the Phase 2 provisions once the alliance is considered sufficiently established." Dylan stopped walking. Greer stopped half a step later, the way people do when they have been waiting for the person they're walking with to stop. "What Phase 2 provisions?" Dylan said. Greer's expression arranged itself into something that was designed to look like mild surprise and was not. "The reassignment clause. Once the alliance stabilizes, typically around the 18-month mark, serving military personnel revert to standard deployment rotation. And the princess, of course, returns to full council oversight for the formal consolidation phase." He paused. "Her emotional autonomy is provisionally extended for the duration of the union period naturally, but the consolidation provisions were always part of the framework. I assumed you'd been fully briefed." He had not been fully briefed. He stood in the corridor for a long moment after Greer had continued on his way, which he did with the unhurried departure of a man who had delivered what he came to deliver and had no further investment in the room. Dylan had been a soldier for 25 years. He understood, in the way that soldiers understood things that civilians sometimes did not, that the official version of an arrangement and the operational reality of it were two related but distinct documents, and that the space between them was where most of the actual decisions lived. He had made peace with that reality a long time ago. He had not made peace with it being applied to Vera. He found her in the storm mapping room, which was one of the places she used when she was not required to be anywhere else. It was a circular chamber in the east tower with viewport glass on three sides and a central display that tracked atmospheric conditions across the entire surface of Tempestus in real time. She was standing at the display, with her back to the door, watching a front moving in from the northern reaches, with the particular quality of attention she gave things she was thinking about rather than things she was simply observing. "There is a front coming from the Varath range," she said without turning. "It will arrive in approximately 6 hours and it will be significant. I have been deciding whether to redirect it." Vara. The quality of his voice turned her around. She read his expression with the rapid assessment of someone who had spent years watching faces for information that people did not intend to give. Her ears angled forward slightly. "What happened?" she said. He told her. He told her plainly and completely, without the framing that would have made it easier to hear, because he had decided that she was owed the undecorated version, and that dressing it up would be a disrespect. He told her about Greer, about the corridor, about the Phase 2 provisions, about the 18-month clock, and what it meant when it ran out. Vara listened without moving. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Outside the viewport, the northern front was still building over the Varath range, gray and towering, accumulating mass and intention. Inside the room, the air developed a weight that was separate from the atmospheric data on the displays. "I knew," she said. The two words landed in the room with a specific gravity that was different from anything she had said before. "You knew," Dylan said. "I knew the framework. I knew the general structure." She turned back to the viewport. Her hands were at her sides, not clasped, not tense, simply present. The specific language of the consolidation provision. The timeline, "I knew." Dylan waited. "I have always known," she said, "that every arrangement made about my life comes with a provision. Every ceremony has a clause. Every gesture of respect is also a plan." Her voice was even, which was not the same as calm. "I have known since I was old enough to understand that the storm courts do not simply celebrate their heirs. They manage them." He said nothing because nothing yet felt adequate. "Who would I have told?" she said. It was not quite a question. "Who in the history of my life in this palace has pushed back on my behalf? Who has stood in a room and said that what was being arranged was not acceptable?" She paused. Not because it was strategically inconvenient, because it was wrong. Outside, the northern front had begun to move. The first advanced clouds were crossing into range of the eastern sensors. The display registered the shift in pressure with its quiet, continuous accuracy. "I didn't," Dylan said. She turned and looked at him. "Push back," he said. "Not yet. I'm telling you now so we can decide what to do about it. Together." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones that had come before. Not the silence of two people maintaining professional distance. Not the silence of a truce between people who had not yet decided what they were to each other. Something was resolving in it, the way Vera had said storms resolved, completing what they needed to complete before the weather could change. The northern front arrived in the capital with a force that the palace's environmental systems registered as significant in log for the record. Rain came down in sheets with structural ambition. Lightning moved through the cloud cover in continuous branching patterns that lit the city in pulses. The display in the storm mapping room updated every 40 seconds with new pressure readings. Vara stood at the viewport and let it run. She did not direct it. She did not moderate it. She simply let it do what it was going to do, which was considerable and loud and thoroughly committed to itself. And she watched it with the expression of someone who understood the necessity of letting something complete itself fully before trying to speak to it. Dylan sat in the chair near the central display and understood that this was something she did not often allow herself, the unmanaged version of it, the one that did not come with performance or restraint, or the careful calibration of what she was permitted to feel in a room where it would be observed and recorded and filed under a category that made it a liability. 2 hours later, when the front had moved through and the city below was settling into the post-storm quiet that felt on Tempestus like a held breath finally released, Vera said, "They have been watching." "Yes," Dylan said. "The transport. The terrace. This room." She did not look away from the viewport. All of it observed, all of it cataloged. I found the filed reports 2 days ago, he said. I was searching for translation protocols in the shared administrative system, and I found Counselor Dre's assessments going back to the first day. They are comprehensive. He paused. They are also selective in what they conclude. She turned from the viewport then. Her expression was not the one he had expected. Not the sharp lightning edge of anger, not the charged quality that preceded a storm. It was something quieter and in some ways more difficult to look at directly. I know, she said. I have always known the rooms were watched. I have simply been deciding whether it mattered enough to address. She paused. I did not think anyone would care enough to tell me. The sentence sat in the room and did not move. Dylan said, they think your jealousy makes you unstable. Vara looked at him steadily. It does, she said, but not in the way they mean. I am not jealous of things. I am not jealous of people or of attention or of whatever it is that they put in their reports when they describe my difficult nature. She crossed her arms, and the gesture was not armor the way it had been in the ceremony hall hologram. It was containment, the gesture of someone holding something that was large and real and theirs. I am jealous of choices. Every decision about my life has arrived in a room before I was invited into it. Every arrangement, every ceremony, every provision, all of it decided before I could object. Dylan said nothing because he was listening, and she seemed to know the difference. That is what makes me what they call unstable, she said. Not anger, not jealousy in the way they write it in their assessments. The simple and specific grief of being the last person consulted about the things that are most entirely mine. Outside, the city settled into rain that was quieter now. Purposeful in the way that post-storm rain was purposeful, doing the work of the weather without the drama of the announcement. Dylan said, they think fear makes soldiers obedient. Vara looked at him. It does, he said, in the same way. Fear makes you comply with the order in front of you. It does not make you think about whether the order is right. The military has been wrong about that for as long as there have been armies, and we have paid for it in ways that are hard to count. He paused. You are not unstable. You are aware of a specific injustice that no one in your life has acknowledged out loud. That is not a malfunction. That is paying attention. Vara was quiet for a long time. The rain continued outside. The storm display updated with its measured frequency, recording the aftermath of the front with the same careful attention it gave everything. They are moving the timeline, she said finally. Dylan had been waiting for this. How far? Dre submitted a revised assessment 4 days ago. The consolidation provision has been accelerated. 18 months reduced to 6 weeks. She looked at him directly. We have 3 weeks remaining. The number landed in the room with the quality of something that had been there all along, waiting to be named. Then we speak first, Dylan said. Vara looked at him for a long moment, her long ears perfectly still. Her expression carrying the particular quality of someone who was deciding whether to trust something that felt, despite all available evidence to the contrary, like it might actually be trustworthy. Outside, the last of the storm passed over the city and moved east toward the open ranges where it could complete itself in private. 3 weeks, Vera said. Then we speak first, Dylan said again. She turned back to the viewport. Below them, the city of Tempestus was emerging from the storm into the particular clarity that follows something large and loud and fully committed. The towers were wet and bright. The walkways were full of people who had been through it before and knew how to come out the other side. For the first time since the arrangement had been made without consulting either of them, they were in the same room with the same information in the same 3 weeks and no performance required of either of them. Dylan said, I should tell you something. Vara waited. When I was in the storm gate, he said the part I never told the debrief. When I turned my radio off, I wasn't being heroic. I turned it off because I didn't want to hear the lieutenant's voice when the structure gave out. Because I knew if I heard someone I recognized, I would start thinking about whether dying in there was reasonable. And once I started thinking about whether it was reasonable, I would probably decide it wasn't. He paused. I stayed because if I started thinking about the exit, I was going to take it. Vara looked at him sideways. Her expression was unreadable in the specific way of someone who is reading something carefully. That is not what the report says, she said. No, he agreed. Why are you telling me this? Dylan looked out at the wet city and the clearing sky. Because you told me the truth about the rooms being watched. And because I've spent 14 days understanding what it costs you to be the only honest person in a room full of people managing their version of you. He paused. And because it seemed like the kind of information that belongs in a conversation between two people who are going to walk into a council chamber together in 3 weeks and tell them they got it wrong. Vera was quiet for a moment. Outside, the first stars were becoming visible through the clearing cloud cover, dim and tentative, as though checking to see if the conditions had settled enough to warrant their appearance. Then she said, "If they send you back tomorrow, would you go?" It was not quite a question. Dylan understood that. He understood that she was not asking about orders or protocols or military obligation. She was asking something simpler and more specific, the kind of question that only gets asked when the answer has begun to matter in a way that was not part of the original arrangement. He did not answer immediately. He looked at the stars coming through the clearing sky, at the city below still wet from the storm, at the woman standing beside him who had been managing her own weather for other people's comfort her entire life and had in the space of 2 weeks stopped managing it quite so carefully in his presence. "No," he said. He said it simply without qualification because the complicated version would have been less honest. Vara did not respond to that directly. She looked back at the viewport, but the quality of the silence between them shifted again, moved into new territory, became something neither of them had a name for yet, which was fine. They had 3 weeks, and then if they did this right, they would have more than 3 weeks. It was not a plan yet, but it was the first moment that felt like the beginning of one. Councillor Dre sent his final pre-consolidation report that night. It was comprehensive, precise, and built with the careful architecture of a document that was designed to arrive at a predetermined conclusion through the accumulation of individually defensible details. He reviewed it twice before transmitting. He made no changes. It said exactly what he needed it to say, and nothing that he had not intended. He sent it at midnight. By the following morning, the council had acknowledged receipt. The clock, which had always been running, was now the only thing in the room that Dre was certain he still controlled. He found that for the first time in 14 years of service to the storm courts, he was not entirely sure that was going to be enough. 3 weeks was not a long time, but Dylan had learned that the weight of a period was not measured in its length. It was measured in what you knew was at the end of it. He had operated in tight windows before. Forward positions with supply lines cut working with what was available and the clock running on what was not. He knew the particular quality of attention that came with a countdown that was real, the way it sharpened the edges of decisions that might otherwise have been deferred, the way it made clarity feel less like an achievement and more like a necessity. He and Vera spent the first morning of the final 3 weeks in the storm mapping room, which had become, without discussion or announcement, the room where things between them happened with the most honesty. Something about the viewports and the moving data and the absence of any furniture designed to communicate hierarchy. It felt like a working room, and Dylan had spent enough of his life in working rooms to know that people were most themselves in them. Vera was already at the central display when he arrived, studying the northern atmospheric data with the focused quiet of someone who had been there for some time before the morning decided to officially begin. "The Vareth front is building again," she said. "Smaller than last week. It will resolve on its own." "Good," Dylan said. He poured himself a measure of the dark liquid the kitchen had taken to leaving for him without being asked, which he had come to regard as a form of institutional acceptance that he valued more than he expected to. He looked at the display. "How do you want to do this?" She turned then. Her expression was composed, but it was the composition of someone who had thought about something carefully and arrived at a position, not the performance of composure for an external audience. "I want to speak to the councils directly. Both of them, the Storm Court and the Coalition delegation. Together. Separately, they will each defer to process. Each will point to the other's requirements as the constraint they cannot override." She moved to the far viewport and looked out at the city still wet from the previous night's light rain. "Together, they have to answer in the same room." Dylan nodded slowly. "You want to demand a joint session. I want to demand one. There is a distinction." She turned back to him. "The petition has to come from me. That is the correct procedural form within the Storm Court. A request from you would be filed under the treaty's military liaison protocols and would take 6 weeks to process through standard channels." "We don't have 6 weeks. We have 3, she said. "The petition comes from me. The session is convened, and then we both walk in." He looked at her for a moment. "Last time someone went alone into something collapsing, that was me," he said, "and it did not go as planned." Something crossed her expression, quick and unguarded. "That," she said, "is a fair point." They spent the next 2 days preparing. Not in the way that formal political preparations were made with advisors and rehearsed statements and documents reviewed by legal staff. They prepared the way Dylan had always prepared for things that mattered by getting the information right, by understanding the specific terrain of what they were walking into, and by being honest about what they did not know. Vera knew the storm court procedural language the way she knew the weather, not as a learned system but as a native one, understanding not just what the words meant, but how they moved and where the pressure points were and what happened when you applied force at the right location. She walked Dylan through the structure of a joint session until he could see it clearly, until he understood not just what would be said, but where in the sequence the real decisions would be made. Dylan knew something else. He knew what it felt like to be in a room where the decision had already been made before you entered it. He knew with the particular certainty of a man who had spent a career developing the instinct for it, where the actual weight of a moment lived. He knew how to stand in a room and make the room understand that the person standing in it was not moving. They will try to separate us before we speak, Vera said on the morning of the day before the session. It is standard procedure. They will want to brief each party independently, so they can calibrate the message for each audience. Yes. She looked at him steadily. If they separate us, they will tell you that Tempestian procedural law requires the princess to address the court alone. They will tell me that coalition military protocols require the sergeant to be debriefed by the diplomatic team before formal testimony. She paused. Neither of these things is entirely false, but neither is required, Dylan said. They are conventional. There is a difference between what procedure demands and what procedure is accustomed to. Her long ears angled slightly forward in the way they did when she was arriving at the final position of an argument. I have been allowing people to tell me that convention was requirement for most of my adult life. I have decided to stop. Dylan nodded once. Then we arrive together and we stay together. Yes, and if they try to separate us anyway, Vara considered this with the focused patience of someone choosing the right word from a language with very precise distinctions. Then she said, we remind them that we are here voluntarily, which is more than can be said for most of what they have arranged. The joint session was convened on a morning when Tempestus was doing something unusual. The sky was the particular shade of gray that preceded significant weather, and the atmospheric sensors across the capital were registering the kind of simultaneous warnings that usually meant Vara was working through something large. But the warnings carried a different quality than the ones the palace systems had learned to brace for. They were not urgent. They were attentive. The pressure systems were watching rather than moving like a very large thing that had decided to pay close attention to what was about to happen and was reserving its response. Dylan noticed this as they walked through the palace corridors toward the session chamber. He did not say anything about it. He had been on Tempestus long enough to have developed a working theory about the relationship between Vera's internal weather and the external one, and the theory suggested that today the planet was doing precisely what she was doing, holding itself in careful readiness. They walked to the session chamber together. The corridor outside was staffed by 2 coalition diplomatic aides and a storm court procedural officer, all 3 of whom were waiting with the specific quality of people who had been briefed on what they were supposed to accomplish in the next 5 minutes. The procedural officer stepped forward with a formal bow and an unrolled scroll of documented protocol. Your Highness, he said, standard procedure requires the petitioning party to enter the session chamber first for the record of formal address. The coalition liaison will be directed to the preparation room for independent briefing in accordance with... No, Vera said. The procedural officer blinked. He was a man who had spent an entire career in the architecture of formal procedure, and he had the particular bewilderment of someone whose architecture had just been declined. Highness, the protocol is conventional, Vara said, not required. She looked at him with the clear attention of someone who has done the research and knows what she found. Article 14 of the Storm Court Procedural Code governs joint interspecies sessions. It specifies that petitioning parties must be present at the convening. It does not specify the sequence of entry or the segregation of parties prior to that convening. She paused. I have read it, both the Tempestian text and the coalition translation. The procedural officer looked at the diplomatic aides. The aides looked at each other. Dylan stood beside Vera and said nothing because she did not need him to say anything, and because he had learned over 14 days and 2 weeks of honest conversation the precise difference between support and interference. They entered the chamber together. The room was already full. The Storm Court Noble Assembly occupied the curved tiers on the Tempestian side, their formal attire in the dark blues and grays of official session, their expressions carrying the particular quality of people who had prepared for a specific situation and were now recalibrating for a slightly different one. On the coalition side, the diplomatic delegation was arranged in the crisp, formal wear of interspecies protocol, with Ambassador Greer in the center seat, his expression warm and arranged and careful. General Bastian was present. He was seated at the far edge of the coalition section, not in the primary diplomatic seats, which Dylan noted immediately and filed. Bastian had not come as a diplomat. He had come as something else, something that had not yet announced what it was. Counselor Dre stood at the front of the Storm Court Assembly with the composed readiness of a man who had prepared this room for this purpose and considered the preparation thorough. He had not prepared for them to walk in together. The pause that moved through the room when they entered was brief but complete. Every conversation stopped. Every arrangement of posture adjusted. Vera walked to the center of the chamber floor at the particular stride that the palace had been recalibrating its gradient for since the first morning, and Dylan walked beside her with the stride of a man who had decided where he was going and had stopped wondering whether the floor approved. Dre stepped forward. "Your Highness, this session was convened at your petition. The procedural sequence requires—" "Counselor Dre," Vara said, "I petition for a joint session. This is a joint session. Proceed." Dre looked at Dylan with the expression of a man who had run a calculation and arrived at a number he had not expected. Dylan looked back at him with the expression of a man who had finished calculating some time ago and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. Dre turned to the assembly and began. He had prepared well. Dylan recognized the quality of the preparation, the way a person who has spent years reading briefs recognizes a well-constructed one, not in the accuracy of the individual facts, but in the architecture of the conclusion they were being arranged to produce. Dre presented the operational assessment of the union's first 3 weeks with the careful language of someone who had spent time selecting which facts to include and which to present in which sequence. The reports were accurate. The observations were documented. The recordings were real. He called it emotional instability. He presented the laughter on the transport as evidence of uncharacteristic behavior under novel stimulus. He presented the terrace conversation as a breach of measured diplomatic conduct. He presented the storm on the 14th night as a significant atmospheric event consistent with elevated emotional disruption. He presented the storm mapping room, the conversations, the quiet mornings, the things that had happened between two people who had been placed in an impossible situation and had chosen it without being asked to be honest with each other. He presented all of it as a liability. Vara listened to the entire presentation without moving. Her ears were still. The air in the chamber was still. Outside, the planet held its attentive gray quiet. Dylan watched her and understood that this was the hardest part, not the arguing, not the preparation, not the 3 weeks of knowing. This was the part where you had to sit in a room and listen to someone describe you accurately and completely and arrive at a conclusion that was wrong, and you had to listen to all of it before you were permitted to respond. He had sat in the rooms like that before. He knew the particular cost of it. He watched Vera absorb that cost without flinching and understood with a clarity he had not expected that it was the most difficult thing he had seen her do. When Dre finished, he looked at Vera with the composed expression of a man who had done his job correctly and was waiting for the institutional response. Vara took a single breath, then she spoke. "Counselor Dre has presented accurate documentation," she said. Her voice moved through the chamber with the quality her voice always had in formal settings, clear, caring, precise. "The events he described occurred. The recordings are genuine. The atmospheric readings are accurate." She paused, and the pause had weight. "He has documented 3 weeks of a person discovering what it feels like to be treated as one. He has filed it as evidence of malfunction." The chamber was quiet. "I laughed on the transport," as she said, "because Sergeant Marsh said something true in a way I had not encountered before. I stood on the terrace and felt something ease because someone spoke to me without requiring me to be a symbol at the same time. I allowed a storm to run its full course on the 14th night because I was, for the first time in my adult life, in a room where I did not have to manage my own weather for someone else's comfort." She looked at Dre directly. "That is what you have been recording. Not instability, nor malady. You have been recording what it looks like when a person is allowed to be one, and you have filed it under a category that makes it a reason to end the arrangement. The storm court side of the chamber was very quiet. Not the quiet of people who disagreed, the quiet of people who were hearing something said out loud that they had not expected to hear, said out loud in this room by this person in this way. Ambassador Greer leaned forward slightly. Your Highness, the consolidation provisions were established to ensure the long-term stability of the alliance, and the framework was designed with both parties' interests in. That was when Dillon spoke. He had not planned the precise moment. He had planned what he was going to say in the way that he planned things, not as a script, but as a set of things that were true and needed to be in the room. The moment arrived when Greer began to explain the provisions that had been designed to ensure Vara's return to oversight, and Dillon understood that the room needed a different voice in it before the explanation finished. Sir, he said. Greer stopped. The room looked at Dillon. I fixed a storm gate, Dillon said. He had not raised his voice. He did not need to. The chamber's acoustics were designed for the formal address of people who understood that volume was not authority. I was alone in an electromagnetic corridor during a level 4 surge, and I realigned a collapsing gate because someone had to, and I was the one who was there. I was not a hero. I was a soldier who had run out of other options and decided that stopping was worse than continuing. He paused. For that, I was awarded a marriage I did not apply for to a woman who did not apply for me in a ceremony where neither of us was asked. The room was listening. Even Trey was listening with the expression of a man who understood that the geometry of the room had shifted and was working out the implications. I am not a treaty clause, Dillon said. I am not a symbol or a diplomatic gesture or a phase in a stabilization process. I am a man who spent 3 weeks on this planet and learned things that I did not expect to learn, and I am standing in this room because I decided to not, because a protocol required it. He looked at Greer, then at Dre, then at the assembled room with the steady attention of a man who has learned to make rooms understand that he is not going anywhere. And neither is she. She is not a provision. She is not an emotional metric to be managed toward an acceptable reading. She is a person who was handed the same arrangement I was handed without being asked, and who has been navigating it with more clarity and more honesty than anyone in this room gave her credit for, because it was more convenient to describe that honesty as instability than to hear what she was actually saying. He stopped. He had learned a long time ago that the most important things lost their authority if you kept talking after them. The chamber held its quiet. Vera stepped forward. Change the tradition, she said, or watch your stability drown. It was not loud. It was not accompanied by lightning or wind or any of the atmospheric demonstration that Vera could have produced if she had chosen to remind the room what it was dealing with. It was simply spoken with the conviction of something that did not need amplification because it was already the largest thing in the room. Outside, the sky moved. Not dramatically, not with the force of the northern front, simply a shift in the pressure, a reorganization of the cloud cover that had been holding itself in attentive stillness since morning. The light in the chamber changed in the particular way it changed on Tempestus when the weather had made a decision and was beginning to enact it. Everyone in the room felt it. Greer looked at the viewport. Dre looked at the viewport. The Storm Court Assembly looked at the viewport and then at Vera, and the look they gave her was measurably different from the look they had given her when she walked in. General Bastian stood up. The room looked at him. He had been sitting in his peripheral position with the stillness of a man waiting for the right moment to indicate what he had actually come for. He stood with the unhurried certainty of someone who had made his decision before he walked into this room and had been waiting for the session to reach the place where the decision became relevant. Ambassador Greer, Bastian said, on behalf of the United Earth Coalition Military Command, I am formally noting for the record that the Phase 2 reassignment provisions of Article 7 were drafted without the consultation of the serving personnel they govern. He looked at Greer with the particular quality of a general looking at a diplomat, the steady, unambiguous quality of someone who understands a different kind of chain of command entirely. That is a procedural error. It will be corrected. Greer's expression did not change visibly, but something behind it did. Bastian turned to the Storm Court Assembly. The coalition does not consider the emotional capacity of a sovereign ally to be within our jurisdiction to manage or assess. Any provision that implies otherwise was not reviewed at the command level. He paused. It is being reviewed now. Dillon looked at Bastian. Bastian met his eyes briefly with the expression of a man who had served long enough to know the difference between orders that were correct and orders that were convenient, and had spent a career deciding which category mattered when the two were not the same thing. The negotiation that followed lasted 4 hours. It was not smooth. It was not ceremonial. It had the quality of a real argument between people with actual positions and actual stakes, which was the most productive kind of argument there was, even when it was exhausting. Legal staff were called in. Documents were reviewed. The procedural officer who had been in the quarter was brought in to clarify the distinction between conventional practice and required protocol on 17 separate occasions, which by the end he appeared to be doing from memory. Dre argued his position with the focused precision of a man who understood that he was losing, but had decided to lose as slowly as possible and on the best terms available to him. He was good at it. Dylan watched the performance with a professional respect he did not express. Greer recalibrated twice, which Dylan watched with the similar respect of someone recognizing a skilled operator, understanding new terrain, and adjusting accordingly. The Storm Court Assembly argued with each other for 40 minutes about a clause in the original treaty language that turned out on examination to be a translation error that had been carried forward unexamined for 16 years, which the translator present for the session found both professionally humiliating and genuinely interesting. Through all of it, Vera stood when anyone was speaking and sat when documents were being reviewed, and spoke with the precision of someone who had been listening carefully her entire life and had decided that today she was going to use everything she had heard. There was a moment near the third hour when the discussion had narrowed to a specific subclause about autonomy provisions, and the Tempestian legal staff were arguing among themselves about precedent, when Vera looked across the chamber at Dylan with an expression that was brief and private, and contained in its brevity something that had no name in either language present in the room. He looked back at her. He nodded once, the small, specific nod that means I see you and I am here, which is not a small thing to communicate across a room full of people who are arguing about clauses. The agreement that emerged was not a victory in the way that victories were usually described. It was not a surrender either. It was the thing that happened when two sides of a real argument both stayed in the room long enough to find the place where the actual problem could be addressed rather than routed around. The marriage would continue under a renewed framework. Not the original treaty framework with its provisions and phase structures and oversight language. A framework that acknowledged both parties as parties, not symbols or assets or phases in a diplomatic sequence. The union would be assessed at 12 months, not for stability, metrics, or emotional oversight, a compliance, but for the simple question of whether both people in it wanted to continue it. Vera would retain full autonomous authority over her role in the storm courts, independent of any emotional assessment conducted by external parties. The word unstable would not appear in any official document related to the Princess of Tempestus without her explicit review and consent. Dylan would not be reassigned without his informed agreement. His deployment status would remain active but discretionary for the duration of the union period, renewable at each 12-month assessment. Counselor Dre would be recused from any further documentation of the union's personal dimensions. General Bastian signed for the coalition. The senior Storm Court noble signed for Tempestus. Greer signed as diplomatic witness with the expression of a man who had decided that this outcome, while not the one he had prepared for, was one he could work with. The first signature on the renewed framework was Vera's. She did not wait for the document to be passed to her. She did not wait for the procedural sequence to call for it. She did not wait for the room to arrange itself for the formal signing moment with the ceremony that would have surrounded it if it had happened in the expected order. She picked up the signing instrument before anyone offered it. She moved to the document where it lay on the central table, still warm from the legal staff's final review, and she wrote her name in the Tempestian formal script, clear and complete and unhurried at the top of the document where the primary party's agreement was recorded. Then she set the instrument down and looked at the room. I am not the last person consulted in about the things that are most entirely mine, she said with the quiet precision of someone stating a fact that was now in the official record and would remain there. Not anymore. The room absorbed this. The nobles, the diplomats, the legal staff, the procedural officer who had spent the last 4 hours clarifying the distinction between convention and requirement more times than he had in his previous year of service. They absorbed it with the particular quality of people who had just witnessed something become true in front of them. Dylan felt it in the back of his throat. The particular warmth of something that was very simple and very real and had not been there before. They left the chamber as the light outside was shifting toward the late afternoon quality that Tempestus did in Gray and Amber when it had completed something significant and was considering what came next. Outside the formal entrance, the corridor was empty. The procedural officer had gone. The aides had dispersed to their respective filing obligations. The documentation was being processed by staff who had somewhere to be. It was one of those rare moments that arrive after large and exhausting things when the machinery of the event has moved on and the people at the center of it are briefly in a space that does not require them to perform any particular role. Dylan stood in the corridor and felt the specific tiredness that came after spending 4 hours being entirely present in a room where the stakes were real. It was not an unpleasant tiredness. It was the tiredness of something finished. Vera stood beside him. Her ears were at rest. Not the careful, neutral position of formal composure which he had learned to recognize as a deliberate arrangement, but the relaxed position of someone who was not currently monitoring anything for threat or managing any output for any audience. Just present, just herself. So, Dylan said. So, Vera said. Free trial, 12 months, renewable by mutual agreement. She looked at him sideways with an expression that was several things at once. You make it sound like a procurement contract. I come from a military. Everything sounds like a procurement contract. She made the sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a breath, but lived precisely between them. It was one of his favorite sounds he had encountered on this planet, though he had not said that and did not plan to yet. Outside the corridor window, the Tempestian sky was doing something Dylan had not seen it do before. Through a break in the cloud cover that was larger than the breaks, usually where stars were beginning to appear. Pale and tentative, the first light of distant things, deciding whether the conditions were finally settled enough to make themselves visible. I want to show you something, Vera said. She led him through corridors he had not been in before, smaller and less formal than the main palace passages, the kind that existed in large buildings for the purpose of getting from one significant place to another without the significance being involved. The palace did not adjust its gradient for him in these corridors, which told him they were old passages built before the building had developed its particular loyalty. He navigated them with the careful attention of a man who had learned to trust his feet more than the floor. They came out onto a high terrace at the back of the palace, one that faced away from the city, out toward the open ranges where the northern fronts built and the open country of Tempestus extended, without the interruption of towers and walkways in the continuous infrastructure of a working city. The sky here was enormous. Without the city's light below it, the darkness had depth, and the stars that had been tentative over the corridor window were here beginning to be definitive. Not many. The cloud cover was still present across most of the sky, but in the break above the open ranges in the gap that the pressure systems had opened and were holding with a patience that felt deliberate, they were real. They were visible. They were present in the sky of Tempestus in the way they were not usually present. And the absence of the city's competing light meant there was nothing between the eye and the fact of them. Dylan stood at the railing of the terrace and looked up and felt in the specific way he had felt it only a handful of times in his life, the particular sensation of being very small in a way that was not diminishing but clarifying. This happens, Vera said, perhaps 4 times a year. When the pressure systems align in a specific way, and the cloud cover opens a gap that holds long enough to see through. She looked up at the visible stars with the expression she used for things that were important to her and that she did not explain to most people. Most of the time, this sky does not show stars. The weather is too active. The cloud cover is continuous. I used to think of it as a limitation. The price of living on a world that is always in motion. And now, Dylan said. She turned to look at him. Now, I think it means that when you see them, you have seen something. Not something routine, not something you can have anytime you look up. Something that required the conditions to be exactly right and then required you to be there when they were. She paused. I prefer that I think. To be given something because the conditions aligned rather than to have it always and never notice it. Dylan looked at the stars and then at the woman who had been watching the same sky her entire life and was describing it to him as though seeing it through his not yet familiar eyes was worth something to her. The storms will remember you, she said, not looking at him, looking at the sky. Her voice carried the quality of something stated because it was true, not because it was comfortable. Is that a threat? Dylan said. A warning. Comforting distinction. I thought so. He looked back at the stars. The break in the cloud cover was holding the pressure systems maintaining their unusual patience as though the planet had decided that this particular opening was worth preserving for a little longer. "I'll take my chances," Dylan said. The break held for another 20 minutes. They stood on the terrace and watched it in the particular companionship of two people who had been through something large together and had arrived without planning to at a quiet place on the other side of it. There was no performance in it, no careful arrangement of expression or posture or words for the benefit of anyone watching. There was no one watching. The palace was behind them, and the open country was in front of them, and the sky was above them, and the weight of the day, 4 hours of argument and documentation, and the particular cost of saying true things in rooms that are not accustomed to them, was settling into the kind of tiredness that is clean rather than heavy. Dylan thought about the storm gate. He thought about the specific weight of standing inside something that was coming apart and deciding not to leave. He thought about the debrief afterward, the official version of events, the clean language that made it into something coherent and presentable, and stripped of the 40 minutes of noise and heat in the particular internal conversation you have when you are alone inside a collapsing thing and trying to decide what matters. He had spent a long time believing that courage was what happened when you stayed in a place that everything was telling you to leave. He was beginning to understand that it was also what happened when you chose to be somewhere that nothing had required you to stay. 12 months, Vera said, breaking the terrace quiet in the way she broke silence when she was ready, not before. 12 months, Dylan agreed. And then we decide. And then we decide. She was quiet for a moment. The cloud cover at the edges of the opening was beginning to close, the way things on Tempestus always eventually did, the weather reasserting its continuous motion, with the unhurried patience of something that was not going anywhere and knew it. "I have never decided before," she said. "Not like this, not about something that was actually mine to decide. Everything has always been arranged before I arrived." "I know," he said. "I think I will be good at it," she said. Not with arrogance, with the simple and honest assessment of someone who had, just for the first time in their adult life, signed their name to something before anyone asked them to. He looked at her in the dark of the terrace. This woman who could change the weather with her attention, who had spent her entire life having the weather of her own life changed by everyone else's decisions, who had walked into a room today and picked up a pen before anyone offered it and signed her name first, because she had decided that she was no longer going to be the last person consulted about the things that were most entirely hers. "I think you already are," he said. The cloud cover closed. The stars went back to being theoretical present, somewhere beyond the continuous motion of the tempestuous sky, but not visible from where they stood, which was fine. They had been there, they had seen them. The conditions had aligned, and they had both been present when they did. Vera straightened from the railing and looked out at the dark country beyond the city, the open ranges still faintly lit by the glow of post-storm atmosphere, the distant rumble of a smaller front building somewhere in the northern reaches, not threatening, simply ongoing, the planet conducting its continuous conversation with itself. "We should go in," she said. "Probably," Dylan agreed. Neither of them moved for another moment. The terrace had the particular quality of outdoor spaces that had been used for important conversations, an accumulated weight of things said in the open air, when rooms felt too enclosed for honesty. Dylan thought of other outdoor spaces he had occupied at significant moments, the particular silence of the field, after the gate closed, the mountain position at first light, the moments between the end of one thing and the understanding of what came next. There was a consistency to those moments that had nothing to do with location. It had to do with the particular quality of attention that arrived when you had come through something and were standing in the space that followed it. "You are doing that thing," Vera said. He looked at her. "What thing?" "The thing where you are thinking about something from before and deciding how it connects to something now." She studied him with her long ears tilted slightly toward him, reading him the way she read the weather, tracking the patterns in his expression with the same attention she gave the leading edges of fronts. "You do it with the same expression you use when you are reading atmospheric data I have given you and trying to understand how the pattern follows from the previous one." "You have been reading my expressions," he said. "I have been observing," she said with the precision of someone using his own distinction back at him. "It is different from cataloging." He looked at her for a moment. "I was thinking about what comes after things," he said. Not in an anxious way, in a straightforward way. "I was thinking that most of my life has been organized around what came before and what came after. Before the storm gate and after. before Tempestus and after. He paused. I was thinking that this is the first time in a while that I don't know what after looks like, and that it doesn't feel the way not knowing usually feels. Vara was quiet for a moment. The smaller front in the north made a low rolling sound that moved across the open ranges and reached the terrace as something barely above the threshold of hearing, the kind of sound you felt more than heard. How does it usually feel, she said. Like something to be managed, he said, like a problem that needs solving before you can proceed. And now, like weather, he said, like something that is going to do what it does regardless. And the only question is whether you understand it well enough to be in the right place when it arrives. Vara looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read and that she did not try to translate into something more accessible. She simply looked at him with it, which he had come to understand was a form of honesty, specific to her, the willingness to have an expression without managing its reception. That, she said finally, is the most tempestuous thing you have said since you arrived. Is that good or bad? He said. Yes, she said. He laughed short and genuine, and the sound of it moved out across the terrace railing and into the dark country beyond the city and became part of the tempestuous night the way sounds became part of the weather here absorbed into the ongoing conversation of a planet that noticed everything. Inside the palace, the documentation of the day's proceedings was being filed with the diligent attention of people who understood that the machinery of formal arrangements required consistent maintenance, regardless of what the principals were doing on the back terrace. The revised framework was being registered in both the Storm Court archives and the Coalition diplomatic record. Legal staff were annotating the sections that superseded the previous provisions. The translator was writing a note about the 16-year-old error she had caught. Counselor Dre was in his private chambers. He had been there since the session ended, sitting with the stillness of a man reviewing a situation that had not arrived at the conclusion he had spent 14 years building toward. He would write no report tonight. There was nothing to file that served the purpose he had been filing for. The category he had been building no longer existed in its previous form. He sat with that in the particular silence of someone discovering that the architecture of their assumptions has been quietly restructured while they were working inside it. Ambassador Guerrier had departed on the evening transport, which was efficient of him and unsurprising. General Bastian had remained. He was in the Coalition liaison quarters with his documentation reviewing the day's proceedings with the focused attention of a man who had come to Tempestus with a specific purpose and was now determining how thoroughly that purpose had been fulfilled. On the back terrace, two people who had been handed an impossible arrangement without being asked were deciding quietly and without ceremony what they wanted to do with it now that they had the choice. Vera turned from the railing. You know, she said with the tone she used when she was going to say something she had been thinking about for longer than she was going to indicate. In the storm courts, there is a saying about arrangements that begin in obligation and end in something else. What does it say? Dylan said. She considered the phrasing. Loosely translated, the storm does not apologize for becoming weather. He looked at her. What does that mean? It means, she said, that things that begin as one thing and become another do not owe anyone an explanation for the change. They simply are what they have become. She turned and walked toward the palace doors. I thought it was relevant. Dylan looked at the closed sky where the stars had been, then at the door she had walked through, then at the door again. Yeah, he said, to the dark country, in the closed sky, in the tempestuous night that was doing what it always did, simply continuing without apology, without explanation in the direction it had decided to go. He followed her inside. The palace settled around them both into the deep hours of the tempestuous night, adjusting its systems to the lower demands of the sleeping hours, reducing its gradients and calibrations, and the continuous small accommodations it made for the person it had been built around. Outside, the weather continued as it always had, not because it was required to, but because on Tempestus, the weather was not a condition of the planet. It was the planet, and tonight, for the first time in a long time, the planet was doing what it did when something large had been resolved and the pressure had equalized and the conditions were finally genuinely right. It was simply being itself, on its own terms, quietly, without being asked.